Okay, so today's tutorial is going to be 3 easy steps to getting bass lines on your track. So this tutorial is aimed at people who don't really have a clue what your bass should be doing. You don't know what notes you should be using. You're struggling as to what extra notes you can use or how you can break up the rhythms or what the rules are for what notes you can and you can't include in your bass lines. So this is going to give you 3 easy ways to get bass lines on your track, especially if the idea of music theory is something that you're struggling with. So we've written this chord sequence, and this chord sequence is based on an idea that I looked at in the Programming Chords If You Don't Know Any Music Theory tutorial, and there's a link to that tutorial below. So if the idea of writing a chord sequence in a key is an alien concept to you and you're really struggling, I suggest you start off with that tutorial first. But if you've written your chords or you're following on from that tutorial, then this is going to show you how to get bass on there. What we've done here is we've got a chord sequence, and the way I've created this chord sequence is by using a handout that we've looked at before. It's one that I wrote called Chord Encyclopedia. And what it is it's all of the chords and scales for all of the most common major and minor keys. And this tune is written in C minor. So what it means is that when I wrote this tune, I got this page up, and these are all of the chords that I can use in C minor to create a chord sequence. And this is the scale of C minor. Now, the chords we use are C minor, G minor and F minor, and the second half of the chord sequence is that reversed. So it starts in F minor, goes to G minor and resolves to C minor. So it's nice and simple. And the scale, this is going to be really handy, because if somebody asked you what the scale of C minor was and you don't know any music theory, your mind is going to go blank. You're not going to have a clue. But what I've tried to do here is I've tried to map it out in as easy way as possible so that you can see exactly what notes you can program and what notes you can't in that key. And above the top, I've even written out the scale itself so you can see what these notes actually are called. So we've written this chord sequence using this handout here. And you've got to the stage where you want to get some bass on your tracks. So step number 1, the absolute easiest way of getting bass on your tracks is to, in fact, let's just delete this from the bass track here, is to get your chords here. I'm going to copy it by holding Alt, moving it up, letting go of the mouse. So we've copied it into our bass here. And double click on it, and here's our chords. And in the bass part, all you do is literally just delete the top notes of your chords. And what you're left with is the bottom note of your chord sequence. And this absolutely fits with your chords because it's in the chords. And it's the absolute easiest way of creating a bass line that fits your tune. And sometimes I use this. So this is the most basic way of doing it, but don't overlook this, especially if the more and more you get advanced, you don't have to be having crazy bass lines that are moving everywhere. Sometimes a really simple bass line that follows the bottom notes of the chord is effective and useful. And the only thing you're going to find is that this is going to be in that mid-frequency range that synths usually work at. That doesn't sound like the range of a bass part. So what you might want to do is draw a box around the whole thing and drag it down, try 1 octave. And if that's still not low enough for your bass, drag it down another octave. If we went any further than that, it starts to sound a bit grainy and muddy down the bottom. So I've stopped there for my bass line. And if I put that in with my track, it sounds great. It fits, it works. The only other thing that I've done here above it, and this is a really great way of maximizing your tracks, and you'll see I've done it a few times here, is that you can take the same part that you've programmed and you can copy it into a similar synth or similar sounding instrument, and it really adds depth and texture to your tracks. So what I've done with this bass is I've duplicated this bass part into a different synth bass here, and they're both playing on top of one another. So let's just have a listen to the second bass on top of that one. we stick that in with the rest of the track. So that's number one. That is absolutely the easiest way of getting bass on your tracks. But if you want to get a little bit more advanced, the next step is to break up that bass rhythm there. So we're not even going to be looking at this idea of scale yet. We're not going to be looking at what extra notes you can use. We're just going to be looking at breaking up the rhythm of that bass line here to create a little bit of an interesting part. And again, we could talk about rhythms, and we could talk about different time signatures and syncopation and things like that, but I want to make this as accessible as possible. So what I've done here, if I double click on the bass part, is you'll see that it follows the bottom notes of the chord, but this time the bass is broken up. And if we just have a little listen to it on its own. And what I've done is I've just broken up these rhythms here. Now, the absolute easiest way to get going with this idea of breaking up rhythm is to do a trial and error method. So just break it up in a couple of different places. If you can pinpoint exactly where that would work in terms of where chord stabs are, or sync it up with bits of your drums, fantastic. But if you're just starting off, just have a try and use your ears and see what sounds good and what doesn't, and experiment. So this, what I've tried to go for, the aim of this is to create something rhythmically interesting, but something that doesn't sound too jarring when it's stuck in with the track with the rest of the instruments. So you want something that's going to play with your chords and your drums, but it's also going to create a little bit of interesting rhythmical variance, if you will. So if we solo this and stick it in with the drums. It just sounds a lot more interesting than it did before. And if I stick the chords in as well, I'll just take that off there. It sounds like a lot more interesting than this part over here. Just a little mixing tip here. You'll see on my bass channel here, it's just going into the red here. So I've got two options. So I can either turn my bass down here, which will stop that clipping, or the other thing is you can either tweak the compression that you've got on here, or maybe add a limiter. So all I've done is just take that down a little bit so it won't be clipping anymore. So step one, bottom note of the chords. Step two, break up the rhythm. Step three, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. Let's just highlight this here. This looks a lot more interesting than it did before. And the trick is with this is that the rule is that at the start of every new chord, so if we go into our chords here, so at the very start of this chord here, and the start of this chord here, and the start of this chord here, the bass should be playing the bottom note of that chord. So on this one, the bass note, this part should be playing C, and this part should be playing G, and this part should be playing F. Now the rule is, so it should look, that's the first note. The rest of this bit, until we get to this note here, you can literally program in any notes that you want. So if we go to our bass line here and see what we've done with it. So the most interesting notes, at the start of this first bar, this chord is C. So actually this first bar, I've just used that rhythmical idea that we talked about before. So it doesn't actually move anywhere apart from on the note of C. When it goes to G, at the start of that chord, G, it's playing the note G. But the other two notes in that little chord change there are just random notes that I've chosen from this scale. So the first one is B flat and the second one is C. So they're actually this one, B flat there and C. And then the chord changes here. So when the chord changes, we need to be playing the bottom note of that chord. So we go to F here. And then it kind of stays on F, and in the middle just nips down to E flat there, back to F, You'll notice that E flat is part of our scale. And then what I've done here is just done a little run there, and then it goes back down to C on the bottom. And at the end of the C chord, I've actually just programmed in 4 random notes up the top here. Now, again, don't overthink it too much. You could think about, if you know your music theory, I'm sure you could come up with all manner of clever bass lines, but this is supposed to be for people who are struggling with the theory side of things. So in terms of using these extra notes, you can use any of them at any time, as long as they are part of the scale. What I mean by that is, say these 2 notes here at the start, we need that to be on C because that's the first note of our, the bottom note of our chord here. But these 2 here, we can actually just choose any notes in our scale and it will sound great. And in fact, actually, this part here, I'm going to do the same thing. So we've got F, which is the first note of our chord here, but our chord doesn't change till we get here. So actually, we're going to use that note there and that note in the scale. And let's just shorten those ever so slightly so that they don't mess each other up. And it's as simple as that. And if we stick, actually, let's just copy our original bass line back in there. So we've got this bass line here, and once we've programmed it, we've copied it into our sub bass here. And if we add our chords in, and that's it. Those are 3 easy ways to get bass lines on your tracks, especially if it's something that you're really struggling with on the music theory side of things. I suggest you experiment with these, especially when you're first starting off. I cannot stress enough that using your ears and learning to train your ears as to what sounds good and what doesn't. The other thing you can do is listen to tracks in a similar genre to yours and see what other people are doing, and your brain and your ear will get used to what a bass line should sound like in that genre. So when you're writing your own, you'll recognize what is a good bass line for that genre and what sounds a bit weird. But hopefully I've given you some ideas to be going on with. If you want to check out the programming chords tutorial, there's a link below. If you want to get a copy of this handout here, the Chord Encyclopedia, is free on my website, and there is a link down below, and there are loads of other resources that you can download for free. I hope this has helped, and please subscribe because there's going to be more tutorials each week. Thanks, bye.